Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Cherry Becker's 2022 Government and Public Sector two-day virtual conference. If you are just now tuning in, my name is Madeline Robbins, and I am our technical producer for Cherry Beckert. We have a variety of presentations planned and will be offering up to 1 hour of CPE per session for a total of 4 hours if you attend all today, and 3 more if you attend on Thursday. The rest of today is comprised of sessions ranging from managing federal grant dollars, fraud protection, and an APA update. We hope you are able to join the remaining sessions. Now, some quick items to note before we get started. To receive CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. CPE certificates will be issued via email within 10 days. If you have not received yours after 10 days, please email cbhlearning@cbh.com. A recorded version of the webinar will also be available in about a week and will be sent via email and posted to our website. Now, if you have questions during the webinar, please type those into the Q&A window located in your control panel down at the bottom of your screen. Just note, we will also be sharing a short survey posted at the conclusion of the webinar. Of course, we value your feedback and ask that you take part. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Denise Lipner, Managing Director in Advisory Services with the State and Local Government Advisory Leader. We are so happy to have her on our team. Denise, take it away.
Thank you, Maddie. Today, we are going to hear from 3 presenters who will discuss various aspects related to managing federal grant dollars. Our first presenter is Kurt Smith, and Kurt will discuss the latest on common issues and best practices on managing federal dollars with an emphasis on the American Rescue Plan Act, otherwise known as ARPA, or someone might have heard as ARP. Kurt, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Kurt Smith, and I've been with Cherry Becker going on 6 years, and I work in the state and local group, of course, with state, local governments, nonprofits, what have you, all about compliance with various federal programs, and also with federal contractors with certain federal acquisition regulations.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. Our next presenter is Paul Volkers. Paul is going to cover the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and what you can do to prepare your organization for it. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. Paul Volkers. I have been with Cherry Becker coming up on a year this fall. Joined Cherry Becker. I've spent almost 30 years working in local government. I was an assistant county administrator or city manager for 2 cities and 2 counties in Maryland outside Washington, D.C., and also down in Florida. And so pleasure to be here.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And finally, we will learn about the Uniform Grant Guidance, otherwise known as a UGG, specifically what triggers a compliance audit, what is reviewed, key pitfalls, and common federal grant compliance audit findings, and how you can avoid them. Covering this topic is Richard Hart. Richard, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you, Denise. My name is Richard Hart. I'm a senior manager now at Cherry Becker. I've been doing single audits for local governments for about a little over a decade now. So I've got some pre-uniform grant guidance experience, post-uniform grant guidance, which we'll be discussing. And I'm hoping I'll be able to answer all your questions and make sure that you're not too stressed out about what single audits coming your way.
All right. Thanks, Richard. So as I said before, we're going to be covering these 3 main areas. And before we delve in, we have a question for the audience. We wanted to take a quick poll to see how well prepared you think your organization is in meeting federal grant compliance requirements. All right. So it looks like, wow, a lot of people feel that they are ready to meet federal grant compliance requirements. Very few are at no's. Interesting.
Denise,
yes?
Denise, maybe we should ask this after our talk later.
I'm actually really surprised that 68% feel that they are well positioned to meet federal grant compliance requirements, because we've been finding that a lot of people, once they really get into things, they realize, oh, well, they might not have the capacity, or they might not have the detailed knowledge specific to a specific award type. agreement that they need to follow the requirements for. So this is really interesting. Appreciate everyone's input. All right, so let me exit out of this. All right, and now we are going to get into ARPA with Kurt. Kurt? Oh, we're going to start off with a polling question. I mixed it up to make things more interesting for you, Kurt.
Thank you.
We're just going to start off with my organization received ARPA funds, and based on the first answer, I'm expecting yes, we have a few questions, or no, we've got this. Okay, so it looks like based on the polling results that perhaps people have just a few questions, but wow, about 25% feel that they have totally got this. Very few have many questions, so great. Thank you for your input today. Appreciate it. All right, so let's exit out of that. And let me advance. There you go. All right, Kurt.
All right,
Take it
cool.
away.
Sure. All right, so ARPA is a huge program. It's almost $2 trillion in economic stimulus. And it was signed into law in March of 2021 to build on the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act of 2020, in an effort to speed up the country's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a wide variety of programs under ARPA spread amongst various federal agencies, including the Departments of Agriculture, Education, Transportation, Health and Human Services, and Treasury, amongst others. Generally, compared to the CARES Act, compliance requirements under ARPA are more stringent, and we have an excellent example of that coming up here in just a couple slides. One of the more well-known programs under ARPA is the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund program. So we'd like to talk about that a bit. All right. So State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, referred to as the Fiscal Recovery Fund, and I can't help but try to pronounce the acronym SLFRF, but I'll try to avoid that. So, all right. So the Fiscal Recovery Fund provides $350 billion in funding to state and local, tribal and territorial governments, as well as non-entitlement units. The funding came in two tranches, half of which came in May of 2021, and the other half came a year later. So at this point, in August of 2022, all the Fiscal Recovery Fund money is pretty much distributed. The question is what to do with it. Okay, so, a year or so ago, people got the first tranche, and let's talk about eligible uses. They had to start under the interim rule, determining what was appropriate use of funds. There are basically four categories. The first one is, and I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail here. You guys, from your responses to the poll questions, I suspect many of you are in state and local government. I think pretty much all of you at this point. I could be wrong, but so you're probably very familiar with the Fiscal Recovery Fund program. You may have dealt, with these decisions determining eligible uses of those funds. But let's go through the four areas real quick. So replacement of lost public sector revenue. So the eligible use for this category is for government services. So quickly put, that's everything governments do for their citizens, programs and assistance and so forth and so on. So the loss of revenue can be calculated two ways, through a formula that was in both the interim and final rules, where a comparison is made between the last full year prior to a pandemic, the revenues in that year, to the revenues in the year of a pandemic, say 2020 or 2021. And the shortfall is calculated using the formula. The other is the standard allowance of $10 million. So what this eligible use category allows governments to do is use this $10 million under the standard allowance or whatever they calculated under the formula to continue to do what they've always done in terms of government services. It's kind of like it is not technically in addition to the general fund, but it's almost as if you've got money on top of your normal revenues in your general fund to do what you use that money to do all the time, year to year, as part of your government services. So it also enables governments, because it's sort of an additional bucket of money, to sort of hit the gas and do things they haven't been able to do in terms of government services. Again, a very broad category. So let's keep rolling along. The second one is addressing the negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. Another broad category, very broad indeed. Provision of premium pay for essential workers. This is, law enforcement and fire and city workers and state workers, just to keep the government services in place during the pandemic. And investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. I'll just say quickly that these two are really cool in that governments can make improvements to their water and sewer infrastructure that they wouldn't be able to make for probably years to come. And they're important to make, and they're necessary and needed. So this is a great opportunity to do that, as well as expand broadband infrastructure, which is something every government wants to do that, and everybody wants broadband access to the internet. Okay, next slide, please. So compliance requirements. So let's just compare compliance requirements under the Fiscal Recovery Fund versus the CARES Act. So the CARES Act, again, that was under Treasury, just like the Fiscal Recovery Fund. CARES Act requirements were very limited in terms of compliance with the grant guidance. Only internal controls, subrecipient monitoring and management, and audit requirements. Real quick, Richard's going to go into this in detail, but the audit, the single audit or program audit requirement under the Uniform Grant Guidance comes into play when you receive, as a recipient or subrecipient, $750,000 of federal money. It could be from cross grants or in a single grant. But when you hit that number, you're now eligible for that audit. You will undergo that audit, is perhaps a better way to put that. By contrast, the Fiscal Recovery Fund requires compliance with all sections of the UGG. And just quickly, let's go to the next slide. I think there's a couple things on there. We kind of go, yep, okay. So the second bullet, let me just go to that real quick. So the post-award requirements of the grant guidance are in 200.300. And these are things like competition, procurement requirements, which include competition, methods of procurement, which include micro purchase threshold of 10,000, small purchase procedures for acquisitions between 10,000 and 250,000, and then formal procedures, which is like an RFP or a sealed bid. When you're over $250,000, you've got to have certain contract provisions built in your agreements. There's and also performance and financial monitoring and reporting. Then there's subrecipient monitoring and reporting. So there's a lot more going on. And there's also the cost principles, which are in 200.400. So the cost principles, quickly, I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, but at 30,000 feet, the cost principles help you define what's a direct cost and an indirect cost. And the Fiscal Recovery Fund terms allow you to, let me back up, put it this way, indirect costs are allowable under the Fiscal Recovery Fund where they were not under the CARES Act. So how do you allocate those costs? You can use the 10% de minimis method, or if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate with the federal government, you can use that. But you have to, of course, first understand what are indirect costs versus direct. In addition, there are selected areas of costs that determine allowability of certain types of costs, like interest, which is expressly unallowable, compensation, which is mostly allowable. I think it's 46 different areas of costs that you need to understand and test to make sure that you are spending the money on allowable costs and not unallowable costs. So we get a lot of questions about that. The first bullet regarding appropriate use of funds, there's a lot of guidance out there. And most of you are probably, if you are involved in the Fiscal Recovery Fund programs within your unit of government, you've probably become familiar with the FAQ and perhaps the final rule, the overview of the final rule, but there's still questions that come up. And it's important to get advice when you're not sure that you're doing the right thing. And of course, we have experience with a variety of governments, state agencies, so we might have a little more context or perspective that we can offer you, or someone like us could offer you. So though questions continue to come up, really with smaller units of government, mostly local, non-existent or immature processes, internal controls, and governance over grant administration. So, local government A that say a small county or small city now has $50 million in cash from the federal government that they need to spend on appropriate, uses and track and administer. And that's just not something they're used to doing. So we help them with their policies and controls and so forth. Certainly how to properly monitor subrecipients. You've got to have your subaward agreements and subrecipient agreements with teeth in them for monitoring and reporting. You've got to make sure they allocate their indirect costs appropriately. You've got to flow down the requirement for a single audit if you're giving them $750,000 or more. And finally, just internally, a lack of sufficient resources knowledgeable in federal grant management, the UGG, and the Fiscal Recovery Fund generally. So anyway, areas of compliance that we tend to run into and help with a lot. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Janice, and thanks, Kurt.
Great.
So Kurt and Richard are really more of your detailed folks that really kind of know the ins and outs in terms of compliance. And I'm going to take a step back and kind of do a little of a bigger picture view. And to me, it's been really interesting just in terms of the evolution of, I think, federal grant requirements and reporting and monitoring. And even going back to the 1970s, when I think that we got the more modern version of federal grant requirements and reporting, the Federal Grant Cooperative Agreement Act, all the way through the Single Audit Act, Accountability and Transparency Act, and then to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009. And it's continued to build on that with the Data Act, the Uniform Guidance. And then we've just seen it's really kind of unprecedented, obviously, with the pandemic over the last few years, with these infusions of federal dollars, and then what state and local governments need to do to comply with those, with the CARES Act, ARPA, and then most recently, and I'm going to just kind of hit some of the highlights of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so again, that's been the most recent, signed into law by President Biden on November 15th, totaling $1.2 trillion for transportation and infrastructure spending. And of that, almost half geared towards new investments and programs, and a lot of that being transportation oriented, as well as energy oriented power infrastructure, and then broadband, as well as water systems. And this most of the funding is really directed over a 5-year period to 2026. So we've got a time frame to work with. Whereas I know everybody's probably deep and heavy into ARPA and has been for a while. You've probably been, more recently, or certainly less so, relative to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and certainly some of that coming through formula distributions, but some of that through competitive opportunities as well. And and that's obviously a key one. If you want to take advantage of those competitive opportunities, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the front end to be ready to be able to take advantage of those when they come out. Interesting thing too is the each time one of these comes out too, we've kind of seen, at least from my perspective over time, it's been additional policy objectives that are incorporated into the federal grant programming and requirements. So you got the policy objectives that are then built into grant requirements, and then the Office of Management and Budget provides guidance. And then the federal agencies are then required to then implement that and really tailoring it to their own programs. But for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's really kind of, in my mind, there's kind of two significant, I would say, policy objectives that were kind of built in. One of those being the Justice 40 initiative. And, with that is the ability to be able to direct funding to lower income communities. And that's been something that each of the federal agencies really need to, again, take the guidance given by OMB and build into their grant opportunities. And with that, it's made a priority for the federal government to commit at least 40% of all federal funds from federal investments to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened with pollution. And that's focused on categories like climate change, clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, training, and workforce development, variety of other areas. So that's a significant guidance that the federal agencies need to follow, and that obviously state and local governments receiving funds will need to to build into how they're approaching the use of the grant funds and also demonstrating compliance. So hitting on some of the sample requirements. So in addition, I'm going to hit on the Build America, Buy America at the end, but you kind of see that the infrastructure bill builds on effective ARPA practices and existing financial management reporting requirements. So it is kind of the evolution that we talked about, includes the uniform grant guidance and then agency-specific requirements. And there's been a trend in really evolution too towards really trying to get better in terms of transparency, in terms of showing how the grant dollars are used, but really also moving towards evidence-based decision and encouraging the federal agencies to be able to, build these outcomes that they're expecting within the grant programs, then also to the recipients to be able to demonstrate that they're actually helping to achieve the outcomes that have been identified. So setting and tracking measurable goals, performance indicators, and milestones, and using data to evaluate and measure progress with a focus on continuous improvement. So I think more and more we're seeing the need to, in terms of reporting, to be able to demonstrate that in a reporting that the federal dollars are being used and contributing towards achieving these outcomes and being able to show this continuous improvement. I'm going to hit on the Build America, Buy America, which again to me is the other kind of big one relative to the infrastructure bill, and that was really focused on prioritizing and incentivizing buying American, helping to bolster the industrial base and supply chains. Also, I think to continue to support, some of which is probably already happening as a result of the pandemic, but onshoring and encouraging investments to expand domestic production. And so there's requirements in whether you're talking about steel, iron, any kind of manufactured products for those receiving the federal grant dollars to meet these requirements. The federal government is giving the ability for agencies to provide strategic waivers if there's particular impediments because of supply chain or other issues, to being able to get particular products. Into the next slide. So some recommendations just to kind of hit highlights it. This is obviously it's a huge opportunity for state and local governments. Things that really, I'll talk kind of specifically to local governments that are really important to think about and focus on. And again, it's never too late to start. You're always best positioned if you've already done it before the grant opportunities become available. But the important thing is to get there. And that's really to coordinate internally across your organization. So making sure there's consistency. And where there's the metropolitan planning organizations, especially for transportation projects, that the local government's projects have been incorporated into those organizational plans, as well as the metropolitan plans. That the organization prioritize its capital needs, develop and update the project pipeline through the capital improvement program. And really to be strategic about looking at the funds that are available through the infrastructure bill and specifically the discretionary funding stream. So what are those competitive dollars, not the formula distributions, but the competitive dollars that really help support local government's goals and support specific projects that you want to achieve and really target those funding streams. And there's been the ability for those that have taken advantage of it, where you've got ARPA funding that's available to really kind of build your track record on that project. So using that funding to help position yourself and get you where you need to be able to strongly compete for some of those infrastructure bill funding opportunities. And those can be also on the broadband side. Most of the states all have broadband agencies, and making sure that you've communicated with those agencies. And making sure that your particular communities and regions' needs are identified and addressed through their maps and through their plans. Developing relationships with key federal agencies and regional offices, having that familiarity where they know you, you know them is essential. Assess your grant compliance capabilities and readiness. Can easily be overlooked, but important to make sure you've got that capability and are ready. And then just taking advantage of opportunities to maximize your funding, your impact, and that you assure compliance. So thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate it.
All right, so we have another polling question. Wondering if you feel that you are ready to maximize this funding, as well as be compliant with all of the requirements related to the infrastructure funding.
Now, the auditor in me says everybody was ready for compliance and stuff, but now you're saying you're not sure if you're ready to maximize.
Well, this has to do with the infrastructure specifically,
Yeah.
right? So it's a little bit different than the ARPA funding. So perhaps because this is fairly new, people have not really delved into it as much. All right. Great. Thank you for participating in that poll. All right. Now, Richard, it's your show now.
All right, so we get to discuss what everybody loves. You love it when an auditor comes back 6 months after the year end, tells you what you did wrong, and then leaves and makes you fix it, right? So the uniform grant guidance is where we're coming in. You all know what uniform grant guidance is based off the first couple of polls, so I won't kind of explain that. For the single audit, as Kurt previously mentioned, it's $750,000 is threshold for a federal compliance requirement. Now that is 750 expended. So, you know, if you're worried and you say, hey, I got $10 million on June 17th, what do I do? I got that award. I would tell you to hold on 13 days and spend it the next year and not worry about that single audit. So, you know, just make sure when you're expending more than 750,000 within federal dollars that you're ready for that single audit, and that's 750 no matter where it's coming from. So you can get money, you know, from the Department of Energy, you can get money from Treasury, as long as it equals up to that 750, you've tipped the threshold. And so as most of you are aware and are probably ready for this, what I just want to kind of point out to is, as you're getting this additional funding, make sure you know your audience, make sure you know who you're giving this money to. Especially the little towns and those individuals that maybe they're not used to getting federal funding and they're not used to getting that assistance. Make sure when you're giving that to them as a subrecipient, et cetera, they're well equipped to handle the requirements that come with it. So within a single audit, it basically covers anyone that's a non-federal entity. So they just utilize the term non-federal entity for who would be required to have a single audit. And so, as you can see, state and local governments, Indian tribes, not-for-profits, et cetera. All right. So the uniform grant guidance is encompassed of multiple parts, as Kurt mentioned, especially with fiscal recovery fund. He was mentioning now you're required to follow all of them. Most of the large counties, cities, been doing this for forever with most of the programs they've been getting, but just make sure you understand it. When I actually have a uniform grant guidance training that I helped create and instruct, and kind of when I tell people and go through it, I say, hey, you know, subpart A's definitions, no, I don't need you to memorize everything, but I need you to scroll through that, make sure you pop out what is relevant for you and in your program, and make sure you keep up with that, just like the definition of non-federal entity is in there. So you just want to make sure that you're going through that subpart. Now, for these other subparts, you can see what they're talking about with the post-award requirements, the cost principles, as Kurt previously mentioned. But the main part that I'm focusing on is subpart F. You know, that's what tells you that now you need to hire an accounting firm, come in, complete your compliance audit for the single audit, and it tells you what requirements there are. So with the compliance supplement, or sorry, with the uniform grant guidance, you would not, you know, it looks big enough with all the subparts, right? But nothing would ever be complete without all the appendices. So within the uniform grant guidance, not only do you have the subparts, but you have 11 appendices. Now, I'm not going to focus and point out all of these, but what I will say is if you read them, not all of them are required for each type of entity, each non-federal entity. So if you're higher education, you're looking at Appendix 3, yes. If you're state and local government, you might be having to look at, you know, the indirect cost proposals in Appendix 7, yes. But what I will say is no matter who you are, you're going to be looking at Appendix 11. Appendix 11 is essentially the guide that auditors have to use to perform their single audit. It's there for you to see. It's published every year, and it is it's not a black box. It's there. So utilize it. Look at it. Look at what your auditor is going to request. You have foster care. You have adoption assistance. You have ARPA now. Look at what the requirements are there and make sure that you're following them. And if you have questions, ask before year end. Ask before, if you can do it before spending, like ask the questions, look at what it says and follow up with it. So within the appendices for a compliance supplement, just focus in on that. Make sure you're looking at it. Another thing I kind of want to just mention for you within the Uniform Grant Guidance is, Denise, the next slide, 200.339. Now, I don't want to scare you with this, but if you don't comply, there are obviously going to be penalties, right? And I mean, Kurt, Paul, do you think the federal government's trying to take away the ability for people to get federal grants? Do you think that's what they're out there to do?
Absolutely not.
Right. The federal government needs all of our local governments to spend the money to help the communities. They can't do it at their level. So you might look at this list and say, oh no, they might take legal action. They might, withhold payments, disallow. The point, if you get to that point to where they're doing this type of things, it's very severe. When we're seeing our typical single audits in our programs, you could have a significant deficiency, and I won't define that for you. If you know, you know, but you could have a significant deficiency or a material weakness within a individual program, but that wouldn't ever cause the federal government to withhold money for you to spend on any federal grant. So, these types of things are mostly related to whenever you have severe non-compliance, whenever it's, you got fraud, et cetera. So, don't worry about looking at these and being scared straight. Just look at these and understand that it can get to this if you don't remediate any issues that you find and you continually misappropriate, misuse federal funds. So we don't want to scare you into thinking that you're going to be debarred, which if any of you deal with procurement, you understand that you never want to be on a suspension and debarment list because you can never do a contract with the government. But we do want you to understand that if items are identified within an audit, within your internal process, make sure you're following up and correcting them. So we've talked about single audit, and just for perspective, I just want to kind of get an understanding and let you understand the differences between single audit and a financial audit. Some of you might be intertwined with both, some might be within one or the other, but single audit is way easier. So I just kind of want to mention that with materiality, for instance, you talk to an auditor with financial statement audits and you ask them, what's your materiality? They're probably going to laugh at you and say, I can't tell you that, right? Well, with the single audit, we tell you, it's the federal government publishes it. $750, you're getting an audit. Like, that's no deal. 25,000 of question calls is being reported. That's no big deal. Other than that, there's no materiality. We're doing compliance. So either it's right, you spin it correctly, or it's wrong and you didn't. There is no materiality. So although there might be, and you can see kind of down there in a couple of more bullets, although there might be that black box, that unknown with a financial statement audit where you're not sure if what's being identified, what threshold of an error or issue it is. With the single audit, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to look at anything over when you spend over $750, and we're going to tell you if it's done correctly or not. That's it. With the types of reports that you submit, we have the schedule of federal expenditures, the schedule of expenditures of federal award. That's a very straightforward, templated, type of report. Very small, very short. With financial statement audits, you have, the basic financial statement. You have the whole ACFR basically. So I won't go through all the pieces, but it's very large. There's a lot of information in there that has to be audited. So the complexity of the audits are way different. We utilize that compliance supplement to make sure that we can, to make sure that we're following kind of the guide that the federal government wants us to, right? With control testing, The main difference with control testing that you need to understand is for a financial audit, an auditor doesn't necessarily have to test controls. They can, and they can utilize that to reduce how much work they have to do, but it's not required. Single audit requires the auditors to test controls, meaning no matter what program, no matter how small of a program, there has to be a control in place to ensure that you're being compliant with the requirements. So if you have even the smallest and the easiest program, there's got to be something in there. So when you're setting up these programs to be the money to be spent, make sure you have something in there where a secondary person is reviewing, because regardless of how insignificant you might think it is, there's requirement for there to be internal controls. So the other thing I just wanted to point out, you cannot, based off of uniform grant guidance, pass that requirement on to a contractor. You cannot tell someone, I'm going to put in our agreement that you have to make sure everything's correct. That's fine. Maybe you can hold them liable later on down the road if there's something wrong, but the federal government's going to come to you and say, I gave you that money. My agreement's between you and I told you to follow that uniform grant guidance. That uniform grant guidance tells you to have internal controls. Keyword meaning internal. So just make sure you understand that there are going to be control tests and there has to be a control in place. As I previously mentioned with the financial statement audit, there's that black box, there's that unknown. You don't know what the auditor is going to ask this year. You don't know what they're going to test. You don't know what line items on the financials they're going to look at. Don't make it so complicated with the single audits. Look at the appendices. It's there for us, it's there for you. Make sure you're looking at that compliance supplement. You know you got the FRF funds. Look at the compliance supplement. See what it says that we have to look at. Now, don't think that that's all you have to do, because the federal government now with the uniform grant guidance does a pick six of the compliance requirements, and they can cycle through those. But if you have subrecipients, no matter if they tell us to audit it or not this year, you need to make sure you're following the requirements for subrecipients. So although you can use the compliance supplement to kind of identify what the auditors are going to ask about, the federal government's always going to reserve the right to come in and look at anything that's required. So just make sure you understand that as well. And then the last thing that's kind of really different is just the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Anyone that gets a single audit has to submit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. It's not anything difficult, but I kind of wanted to point that out because if you're utilizing a subrecipient and they've had single audits in the past, you can look them up in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. As long as they've had one, they're in there. And so you can utilize that to search. So I think with that, we can go to the next polling question.
All right, Richard, do you want to add commentary on this one?
Oh yeah, I heard I get 60 seconds of uninterrupted time with everyone. So the only commentary I was going to add is make sure that when you say you understand the requirements, true or false, you understand. Make sure you understand all of the facets of the requirements. Make sure you understand what you have to do for subrecipients. Make sure you understand the definition of a subrecipient. Go back to that subpart A. Look at, what a subrecipient is. Go into the 300 section. You got to make sure that you know what it is. I don't take anything for granted. So if I don't understand a specific word, or if I think I'm generalizing it, look it up. I mean, I just look up the definitions of simple words all the time, and I surprise myself because people misinterpret things after a couple of years of thinking you know what something means. So if you think you understand the requirements, just look again.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. I also think, I think you also provide some resources. So here are some links. I don't know, Richard, if you want to delve into this more, but basically it's a link to the UGG and the compliance supplement that Richard has spoken length about.
As I told you, it's there, so just use it.
Yep. So we have a couple questions actually that I'd like to ask. And the first one goes to you, Richard. So specifically to audits, what are the top 2 issues that you've noticed lately that you would like to warn viewers about as they ensure that they maintain compliance with federal grant requirements?
The two I've been seeing pop up recently that I'm having to coach people through is one, subrecipient monitoring. You need to make sure that you have the correct monitoring policies in place to perform that subrecipient monitoring. And that subrecipient monitoring does not stop once you review their single audit, once you review their reports. If you identify errors or issues, you have to follow up. I mean, could you imagine if we do a single audit, find multiple errors, and then the next year we just forget about it? And we can't do that, and you can't either. So just when you're doing subrecipient monitoring, make sure that you're following up with any items you identify, and make sure that you're correctly determining if they're a subrecipient or not. There is, complete different definition between subrecipient and contractor. And you want to make sure you're on the right side of that, because subrecipient requires a lot more follow-up and monitoring than a contractor. And I created a whole training based off the definition, the difference between those two entities, and I've taught it to a few different localities. The other thing I would say is internal controls. I've been recently seeing that people, as I mentioned earlier, they're kind of trying to pass off the buck with the required of making sure everything's correct and within guidance. You cannot pass off an internal control to a contractor. It is internal. So if an auditor comes to you and says, how do you ensure that this is approved and correct? You can't say this third party does that for us. We have an agreement with them. That's not going to suffice. You have to have something internally to ensure that you're reasonably compliant. So those are the two things that I've been seeing recently.
All right, great. Thanks, Richard. Kurt, now that SLFR, I can't even say that right either. SLFRF funds.
SLFRF.
That reminds me of the Smurfs. I don't know why.
I know it.
Picture of a green Smurf, a blue Smurf, sorry. So anyway, now that the funds are distributed, what should recipients at the state and local level focus on at this point?
Well, given the requirement to, I don't think I mentioned this, but I think most of you know this. There's a requirement with the fiscal recovery funds to encumber funds by December 31, 2024, and spend the funds by 2026. So it's important that recipients and subrecipients focus on meeting those deadlines. So quickly, for a subrecipient, and part of your monitoring, you would put this in the agreement, the subaward agreement, or maybe the subcontract. And you would make sure that those subrecipients and subcontractors observe those, the spending of the funds, that your contract has that term in it by the end of 2026. So you, in your contracts for water, sewer, or broadband delivery infrastructure, or establishing subaward agreements for the provision of assistance or funding of programs. In terms of encumbering those funds, you've got to have the subaward agreement or subcontract agreement in place. Might have a purchase order. So, an instrument like an agreement that encumbers the funds. And then you need to spend them by the end of 2026. So we recommend that final invoices for contract performance be received by 12/31/26, with final payment following immediately thereafter. And that subrecipients expend all funds received for assistance or programs prior to the end of 2026.
Okay, great. Are there any other compliance concerns that are important that you'd want to make sure our audience is aware about?
Well, it's interesting. Subrecipient monitoring keeps coming up in this whole presentation today, and we often encounter questions regarding subrecipient monitoring. So, this is in my area of practice. Obviously, Richard encounters it in his audit area of practice. In my experience, local governments are often unfamiliar with monitoring requirements under federal awards and may need some help. It is incumbent on these units of government to carefully monitor the use of funds by subrecipients. Richard basically just said that. We recommend flowing down the terms of the federal award to subrecipients, especially with regard to, for example, competitive procurements, use of the appropriate method of indirect cost allocation, maybe the 10% de minimis rate, tracking in the subrecipient accounting system, their accounting system, what have you, which means documentation of funds received and expended, and the requirement for a single or program audit if the subrecipient received over $750,000 in awarded funds.
Okay, Great. Thanks so much, Kurt. So Paul, we'll end it with you. Do you see any changes in the federal government's approach to grants as we progress from CARES Act to ARPA and now the Investment Act?
I do certainly, and I think initially in terms of the CARES Act, in ARPA, there was really a push to really stop the bleeding, to be able to help provide state and local governments the funding to be able to keep things going, to be able to keep their staff, to be able to keep providing core services, as well as the additional services needed to address the issues that arose with the pandemic. So a lot of that was really, I think, stopgap funding, but then we saw, I think a bit of and there were fewer requirements, but then I think we saw as we proceeded through to ARPA and now the infrastructure bill, is some of the building back in of the traditional requirements. Other requirements are always there, but the traditional requirements, but then kind of catching back, I think, with where the evolution's already been in terms of greater transparency, greater accountability. And also really focusing on data-driven, evidence-based grant making and demonstrating that outcomes are being achieved.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. And with that, Maddie, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Denise. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's second session. Again, if you have any questions, do feel free to follow up with Paul, Denise, Richard, and Kurt. We will be sharing their contact info. You might have seen it on the slide there in front of you as well. But we value your feedback. We will also be sending a link to a survey here shortly. And if you are joining us for the whole series today for the Government Public Sector Seminar, we will be picking up here in about 20 minutes at 11:50 Eastern for our next session. That'll be the third session. A reminder, for all of these, you are eligible for 1 hour of CPE if you do participate in 3 of the 4 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. So thank you for being part of session 2. The next one is on fraud protection, and we will see you here in about 20 minutes at 11:50 Eastern. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.